Get ready for a story that defies everything you think you know about power, faith, and miracles. For centuries, they've told us that great leaders are born in palaces, amidst crowns and intrigues. But what if I told you that an entire nation's greatest heroine emerged from obscurity, from a tiny forgotten village, and that she, alone in her adolescence, managed to turn the tide of the most devastating war of the Middle Ages? It's a counterintuitive claim, I know. After all, how could a simple peasant girl with no army, no money, no training, change the fate of a kingdom? The truth is, the faith of a single young woman, driven by voices no one else heard, was the fuel that reignited hope in a nation in ruins. Imagine a shattered France, its lands under enemy rule and its monarchy on the brink of collapse. It was a scenario of impending despair, where military and political logic dictated imminent defeat. But it's precisely at this point of maximum darkness that the most polarizing and inspiring figure of all time emerges. Joan of Arc, a girl who, to many, was a dangerous witch, and to others, God's own messenger. The controversy surrounding her was immense, and what she did next defied all expectations, offering a swift reward for a nation hungry for victories. Her journey, packed with divine visions, impossible battles, and a trial that became a sham, isn't just a tale from the past. It's a vivid reminder that the power of unwavering belief can move mountains, turn defeats into triumphs, and shape the course of history in ways that science and strategy could never predict. Are you ready to dive into the secrets and the truth behind the legend that still resonates in our hearts today? If this story has captivated you and left you wanting to know more, don't forget to like this video. Your like is super important to us, as it helps spread these incredible stories to even more people. And to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming epic videos, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We want to know how far Joan of Arc's legend reaches. Comment below what city or country you're watching from. In the turbulent 15th century, a veil of desolation and uncertainty hung over the Kingdom of France. It wasn't merely a nation on the verge of collapse, but an entire civilization that seemed to unravel under the weight of incessant conflicts and internal betrayals. The year 1415 had marked a brutal turning point with the humiliating defeat at Agincourt, where English forces, outnumbered, decimated the French nobility, leaving a leadership vacuum and a deep wound in the country's morale. The Hundred Years' War, a dynastic conflict that had dragged on for decades, had transformed much of French territory into a desolate battlefield, dotted with burned villages and ruined fields. Once prosperous cities lay under foreign rule, their inhabitants oppressed by taxes and the constant threat of looting and violence. The Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420, sealed what many considered France's definitive downfall. It designated the English king Henry V as heir to the French throne, delegitimizing the Dauphin Charles, the son of the dying king Charles VI. This scenario of disintegration was not merely political or military. It was an existential crisis that undermined the very identity of France. The monarchy, once a beacon of unity, was fragmented. The loyalty of vassals was a bargaining chip, and many nobles, especially those from the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, had allied themselves with the English invaders, tearing apart the social fabric of the kingdom. The figure of Dauphin Charles was, for many, a pale reflection of a king. Exiled in Bourges, derisively known as the King of Bourges, he lacked charisma, resources, and above all, the moral authority to unify a people on the brink of despair. His advisors were divided, the kingdom's finances depleted, and the French troops, demoralized by years of humiliating defeats, were but shadows of their former selves. The heavy cavalry, France's pride, had been repeatedly annihilated by English longbowmen in battles like Crécy, Poitiers, and most recently Agincourt, forcing a painful reevaluation of their tactics and military traditions. Society, beyond the war, faced the echoes of devastating epidemics, such as the Black Death, which had swept across Europe in the previous century, leaving a trail of death and social and economic instability. Fear and superstition permeated daily life, and faith, though still central, was often tested by the brutality of reality. Prayers for a miracle were whispered in empty churches, and hope was a flickering flame, almost extinguished waiting for something or someone to rekindle it. It was into this abyss of despair that Providence, or destiny, was preparing to cast a figure who would defy all expectations and change the course of history in a way no one could have predicted. The stage was set for the arrival of an improbable figure, born of the humblest origins, who would challenge the military and political logic of her time. France, wounded and kneeling, awaited a sign, a voice, a flame that could guide its people back to the light. Far from the war-torn landscape and court intrigues, in the remote and tranquil village of Domremy-la-Pucelle, nestled on the border between the territory loyal to the Dauphin and the lands of Burgundy, a young woman was growing up, destined to alter the course of history. Joan of Arc, born around 1412, was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, honest and deeply religious peasants. Her childhood unfolded in a simple, idyllic setting, dictated by the cycles of agriculture and the prayers in the small local church. Domremy, though isolated, was not immune to the distant echoes of the 100 Years' War. Sporadically, raids and conflicts in neighboring villages reminded its inhabitants of the constant threat hanging over France. The young Joan, however, distinguished herself from her peers by an unusual devotion and a spiritual sensitivity that seemed to transcend her tender age. She was a serious and reserved girl with a pure heart and an unwavering faith who spent long hours in prayer and contemplation. It was amidst this seemingly ordinary life, around the age of 13, that Joan began to experience extraordinary phenomena, visions and voices that she attributed to a divine origin. Initially, these celestial whispers were gentle and sporadic, messages that exhorted her to piety and devotion. She did not perceive them as hallucinations, but as direct communications from God, transmitted through her patron saints. These first divine encounters often occurred in places of spiritual significance to her, such as her father's garden, near the village church, or under the fairies tree, an ancient beech tree that local tradition associated with pagan rituals, but which for Joan was a place of serenity and connection to the transcendent. At first the voices were vague, speaking of Joan's need to be a good girl and to go to church frequently, strengthening her faith and her connection with the divine. She kept them to herself, fearing she would not be understood or would be ridiculed. However, the frequency and clarity of these communications progressively increased, and with them, the urgency of their message. It was no longer just about the salvation of her soul, but about the salvation of an entire nation. The innocence of her childhood began to be replaced by a sense of grand purpose, a calling that would take her from her humble condition to the center of a seemingly endless conflict. These first divine manifestations were the foundation of her conviction. In a world where faith was the moral compass and the explanation for the inexplicable, Joan interpreted these signs as a direct mandate from heaven, a burden that she, despite her youth and inexperience, felt compelled to carry. The destiny of France, according to her visions, no longer rested in the hands of wavering kings and generals, but in the courage of a simple shepherdess from Domremy. The visions and voices that Joan of Arc experienced in Domremy were not mere whispers. They progressively became clearer, more imperative, and above all, charged with a mission of epic proportions. Far from being childish fantasies for Joan, they were the very voice of God, transmitted through her most revered saints. The main celestial figures who accompanied her on her mystical journey were Saint Michael the Archangel, God's warrior who commanded the heavenly hosts and expelled evil; Saint Catherine of Alexandria, a wise virgin martyr, a symbol of intellectual strength and unwavering faith; and Saint Margaret of Antioch, another virgin martyr, often invoked for protection against evil and to aid in childbirth. The choice of these figures was not random. They represented crucial aspects of the mission to be entrusted to Joan: spiritual and physical battle, Saint Michael; the wisdom and discernment necessary to deal with the secular world, Saint Catherine; and resilience and purity, Saint Margaret. The voices began to dictate to Joan a task seemingly impossible for an illiterate peasant girl: to liberate France from English domination and to crown the Dauphin Charles VII as the legitimate king in Reims. The urgency of the messages grew as the situation in France deteriorated. The voices not only instructed her about her divine role, but also psychologically prepared her for the monumental challenges she would face. They comforted her, encouraged her, and warned her about dangers. Joan described the experience as real and tangible, feeling the presence of the saints and hearing their words with clarity. For her, there was no doubt that they were divine manifestations, and her obedience to these commands was absolute. This aspect of her story, though inexplicable by Cartesian logic, is the core of her strength and conviction. In a deeply religious era, the idea of a divine messenger was not uncommon, and many people, including members of the nobility and clergy, sought signs and wonders. However, the scale of Joan's mission and the fact that it was entrusted to a young woman of humble origin were indeed extraordinary. The voices did not just instruct her to pray, but to act, to wield a sword, metaphorically at first, and to influence the destiny of a nation. This unwavering conviction in her divine mission was what propelled her to overcome the initial obstacles, the skepticism of her family, neighbors, and later, the authorities. She was convinced that she was an instrument of God's will, chosen to fulfill an ancient prophecy that spoke of a virgin from Lorraine who would save France. This prophecy, though without solid historical proof of its existence before Joan, certainly gained strength and was reinterpreted to fit her figure, reinforcing the popular belief in her divinity. The voices, therefore, were not just a personal phenomenon for Joan. They were the foundation of her authority, the source of her courage, and the engine of her extraordinary journey. They transformed her from a simple peasant into a prophetic warrior, ready to defy the social and military norms of her time in the name of a greater cause. With celestial voices echoing in her mind and a grand purpose etched into her soul, Joan of Arc faced a challenge as formidable as the war itself, convincing the world around her of her divine mission. Initially, her family and neighbors in Domremy reacted with the incredulity and concern typical of devout but fearful peasants. They saw her claims not as a divine calling, but as dangerous delusions or, worse, signs of mental affliction. Her parents tried to dissuade her, even planning an arranged marriage in the hope of curing her of such fantasies and reintegrating her into domestic life. For them, the idea of an inexperienced young woman, and moreover a woman leading armies and interacting with royalty, was as absurd as it was dangerous. However, Joan's determination was a force of nature. Her faith was not mere belief, but a visceral conviction that allowed no doubt. She was relentless in her purpose. The voices had become more insistent, and the urgency of France's situation was palpable even in her small village. It was as if France itself cried out for her help, and Joan felt the weight of that responsibility. She knew she had to act, and that time was running out. Her first attempt to break through local skepticism was with her uncle, Durand Laxart, whom she finally convinced of the seriousness of her intentions. He, in turn, took her to Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the garrison at Vaucouleurs, the nearest fortified town. Baudricourt, a pragmatic and skeptical man, initially dismissed Joan with disdain, advising her to go home and get a beating from her father. "Go home and get a beating from your father," he reportedly said, expressing the common sentiment of the time about women and war. But Joan was not intimidated. Her persistence was extraordinary. She returned several times, each time more vehemently, reaffirming her mission and citing the military disasters afflicting France as proof of the urgency of her calling. She even allegedly predicted the French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings, the Siege of Orléans, which was confirmed shortly after, beginning to shake Baudricourt's conviction. Her reputation as a virgin and her apparent purity, in an era where morality and divine intervention were seen as real forces, began to generate fascination. Gradually, Joan's unwavering conviction began to erode the skepticism of Baudricourt and some of his men. The idea that she might be a divine emissary, or at least a sign of hope in such dark times, began to gain traction. France was desperate, and in desperation, logic often gives way to faith and miracles. Joan's persistence, her unwavering belief in her mission, and her alleged ability to predict certain unproven events, though mentioned in later accounts, were crucial for the captain to finally yield, opening the doors for her journey to the heart of the kingdom. Joan of Arc's journey from Domremy to Vaucouleurs was the first concrete step in her extraordinary mission, an initial test of her faith and determination. After several attempts and Joan's unwavering persistence, Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the Vaucouleurs garrison, finally relented, though still with a good dose of skepticism. Baudricourt's decision was not driven by blind belief in Joan's visions, but rather by a combination of factors. Joan's increasing pressure, which seemed tireless, the testimony of people who knew her, like her uncle Durand Laxart, who attested to her sincerity and devotion, and, crucially, France's desperate military situation, which made any promise of help, even from an improbable source, worthy of consideration. The year was 1429. Joan, at just 17 years old, needed to travel about 250 kilometers through dangerous territory, often controlled by Burgundian factions or mercenary bands. The journey itself was an act of bravery, requiring physical courage and unwavering faith. For this journey, she adopted men's clothing, which would be a point of controversy in her future trial. Although historical sources do not confirm the exact reason, it is generally accepted that this choice aimed to protect her from sexual assault during the journey, and also to facilitate her movement in an environment dominated by men and constant dangers. This attire was also a symbol of her renunciation of the feminine social conventions of the time, a visual declaration of her unusual mission. Baudricourt provided her with a small escort, consisting of some of his trusted men, including Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, who would become her first loyal companions. These men, initially skeptical, were impressed by Joan's piety, determination, and seriousness. The journey lasted 11 days, an arduous trek through precarious roads and dense forests. During the journey, Joan showed no fear or uncertainty. Instead, she inspired her companions with her conviction, praying daily and remaining steadfast in her purpose. This phase of Joan's life is fundamental, as it marks her transition from a reclusive peasant girl to a public figure, a herald of new hope. It was during this journey that she began to forge the image of the prophesied maid, the virgin who would come to save France. The arrival in Chinon, where Dauphin Charles VII was taking refuge, was the ultimate goal of this first stage. Vaucouleurs had been the gateway to her destiny, and the audacity of her journey, her courage in the face of danger, and her ability to inspire even the most skeptical were the first tangible proofs that Joan of Arc was not an ordinary peasant, but a young woman with an extraordinary purpose, perhaps divinely ordained. This journey was more than a mere physical displacement. It was a symbolic passage where Joan left behind a life of obscurity to embrace an epic destiny. Joan of Arc's arrival at Chinon, the fortress where Dauphin Charles VII sought refuge, in February 1429, marked one of the most enigmatic and crucial moments in her story. News that a young peasant girl claimed to have a divine mission to save France and crown the king had already reached the court. However, skepticism was prevalent among the Dauphin's advisors, accustomed to prophecies and charlatans in times of despair. Charles VII, a cautious and mistrustful man who lived under the constant threat of intrigue and assassination, decided to test Joan. The most famous test, though without solid historical proof, became an inseparable part of Joan's legend. According to tradition, when Joan was finally admitted to the Great Hall of Chinon, Charles VII was disguised among the crowd of courtiers, having exchanged places with one of his men, while another nobleman occupied his throne. The objective was to see if Joan, guided by her supposed divine visions, could identify him without being told. And, to the surprise and astonishment of all, Joan reportedly walked directly to the disguised man, bowing and addressing him as the true Dauphin. "In God's name, gentle prince, it is you and no other," she is said to have declared, shocking everyone present. After the recognition, Joan approached Charles and allegedly whispered something private to him, a secret only the two of them knew. Although the exact content of this conversation was never publicly revealed by Charles, sources indicate that Joan reassured the Dauphin about his legitimacy as heir to the throne, and about a personal secret that tormented him, perhaps a doubt about his own succession, or a hidden sin, thus proving the divine nature of her mission. This moment was a turning point. Even if the king did not immediately embrace her cause, the Chinon episode created an aura of mystery and legitimacy around Joan. She was not just a peasant, she was an envoy from God who could see beyond appearances. This event, regardless of its literal veracity, served to strengthen belief in divine providence and Joan's legitimacy among both the court and the people. Joan's recognition of the Dauphin was not the only test, but certainly the most impactful. It opened the doors for a deeper investigation of her claims, but more importantly, it gave her the initial credibility needed for her voices and her mission to be taken seriously in such a skeptical and political environment. That encounter was not just a dialogue between a young woman and a monarch. It was the moment when hope, personified in Joan of Arc, began to penetrate the walls of French despair. From then on, the question was no longer, who is this girl? But what can she do for France? Even after the remarkable episode at Chinon, the skepticism of the French court persisted and even intensified. The idea of a young peasant girl leading armies was, at the very least, unorthodox, and for many nobles and ecclesiastics, laughable or dangerous. Dauphin Charles VII, though impressed, was a cautious and hesitant man, surrounded by advisors who viewed Joan with suspicion and even hostility. They feared she might be a heretic, a witch sent by the enemy, or simply a madwoman who could further destabilize the already fragile situation of the kingdom. The nobility, accustomed to dealing with power through lineage and privilege, looked with disdain upon the ascent of a woman of the common people. To dispel these doubts and ensure the legitimacy of Joan's mission, a rigorous theological examination was instituted in Poitiers. For several weeks, Joan was interrogated by some of the most renowned theologians and doctors of the church of the time. They questioned her about her visions, the nature of her voices, her faith, her morality, and her religious knowledge. The objective was to determine whether she was inspired by God or by the devil, or if she was simply an impostor. The inquisitors sought inconsistencies in her answers, signs of heresy or witchcraft. To the surprise of many, Joan demonstrated remarkable insight and unwavering faith. Despite being illiterate and without formal theological training, she answered complex questions with simplicity, logic, and a conviction that disarmed her interrogators. When asked about the language of her voices, she confidently replied, "I hear them in good French." Asked if she believed in God, she retorted, "Yes, more than you do." Her purity and devotion were evident, and she refused to fall into the theological trap set for her. There were no signs of presumption, only a deep certainty of her mission. After a thorough examination of her virginity, which was a crucial condition for a virgin who claimed divine contact and a protective factor against accusations of witchcraft, the final report from the Poitiers panel was, though cautious, favorable. It declared that Joan was a good Christian, that her visions seemed to come from God, and that there was nothing evil in her. They concluded that she should be tested in her ability to lead, as the Dauphin had nothing to lose. This opinion, though not an unconditional approval, was enough for Charles VII, pressured by the desperate military situation, to decide to trust her. The test of faith in Poitiers not only legitimized Joan in the eyes of the church and the court, but also strengthened her own conviction and resolved some of the Dauphin's internal skepticism. He was about to entrust the fate of his kingdom to a young peasant girl, a colossal risk, but one that seemed to be the only spark of hope in a dark future. With the cautious approval of the Poitiers theologians and the pressing reality of the desperate French military situation, Dauphin Charles VII finally made a monumental decision. He would accept Joan of Arc and place her at the head of his troops. This was one of the boldest and, for many, most irrational decisions of his reign. It was an act of faith amidst despair, a gamble against all logical odds. France was on its knees, and the idea of a young peasant girl leading an army to liberate the strategically vital city of Orléans, besieged by the English, was unthinkable. However, Joan's charisma, her unwavering conviction, and Charles VII's own desperation combined to pave the way for what seemed like a miracle. Joan's official acceptance by the court marked a turning point in her journey. She was no longer just the maid of Domremy. She would become the military leader who, according to her visions, would save France. To fulfill her mission, it was essential that she presented herself not only with spiritual authority, but also with the image of a warrior. Thus, she was provided with a white armor custom-made in Tours, which would distinguish her on the battlefield. It was not merely physical protection, but a powerful visual symbol. This armor, reportedly commissioned by her voices and described by her in detail to the armorers, was an artifact that blended military pragmatism with religious symbolism. The white color represented her purity and her divine mission. It was not the armor of a noble knightess, but of an envoy from God. In addition to the armor, Joan requested a specific sword, which she claimed had been revealed to her by the voices. This sword, according to legend, was buried behind the altar of the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, a pilgrimage site dedicated to Saint Catherine, one of her guiding saints. When the sword was found, rusted but with 5 crosses engraved on its blade, the event was interpreted as further divine validation of her mission, increasing the faith of the people and the troops in her leadership. The provision of the armor and sword was more than a gesture from Charles VII. It was a declaration that he, the Dauphin of France, was placing his last hopes in Joan of Arc. The news that a virgin sent by God was ready to lead the troops spread rapidly among the people and soldiers, rekindling a flame of hope that had long been extinguished. The troops, previously demoralized, now saw in her not just a captain but a living miracle. That moment marked the birth of Joan of Arc as the warrior of God, ready to enter combat and reverse the destiny of a nation. The white armor, which would soon shine on the battlefields, would be a beacon of hope amidst the darkness of war. More than her armor and sword, which were symbols of her military function, Joan of Arc's standard became the most powerful icon of her divine mission and the renewal of French hope. Joan, in fact, declared that she preferred her standard to her sword in battle, as it was a symbol of inspiration and faith, not violence. "I carried it in my hands when I advanced against the English," she would later testify, "and I did not use my sword. The standard gave courage to my men." The standard was crafted according to Joan's detailed instructions. It was made of white linen and decorated with the image of Jesus Christ in majesty, seated on the world, with 2 angels kneeling at his sides. On one edge, the names Jesus and Mary, the central figures of her devotion, were inscribed. The use of the fleur-de-lis, symbol of French royalty, was also present, uniting the sacredness of her mission with the legitimacy of the monarchy. This was not a mere military pavilion. It was a sacred object, a crusading banner that invoked divine protection over the French troops. It was a symbol that transcended politics and military strategy, appealing directly to the faith and religious fervor of the people and soldiers. In a time where religion permeated all aspects of life, and war was often justified in divine terms, Joan's standard was a psychological tool of immense power. For the French soldiers, seeing it fluttering in the wind on the battlefield was a visible reminder that God was on their side, that their cause was just and blessed. It infused courage into the hearts of the combatants and inspired devotion. For the English enemies and their allies, the standard was an object of fear and, for some, of superstition. The Maid and her white banner with divine figures were seen as a sign, perhaps of supernatural intervention, that was turning the tide of the war in favor of the French. Joan personally carried the standard in many battles, keeping it visible in the thick of the action. She believed that her primary function was not to fight with a sword, but to spiritually inspire and lead the troops, and the standard was the perfect vehicle for that inspiration. It represented the purity of her cause, the legitimacy of the Dauphin, and the divine protection that she believed accompanied her actions. The figure of Joan, wearing her white armor and carrying her sacred standard, became the personification of French hope. It was not just a piece of fabric. It was a living symbol of France's resurrection, a call to unity and struggle under divine auspices. It was the harbinger that something extraordinary was about to happen in Orléans, where France's destiny awaited her intervention. The city of Orléans was on its last breath, besieged by the English since October 1428. The gateway to the south of France, as it was known, was of vital strategic importance. Its fall would not only mean the loss of one of the last great cities loyal to Dauphin Charles VII, but would also open the way for the English to advance on Bourges, Charles's provisional capital, sealing the fate of the French monarchy. Months of siege had exhausted the defenders and the population. Famine and disease spread, and morale was shattered. The English had built a series of fortifications around the city, the Bastilles, which isolated it from any external help. The hope of liberation was almost non-existent. It was in this scenario of imminent despair that the rumor of the arrival of a maid sent by God began to circulate among the besieged. When Joan of Arc, wearing her white armor and wielding her sacred standard, arrived on the banks of the Loire River near Orléans on April 29, 1429, her arrival was met with a mixture of euphoria and skepticism. She had managed to enter the city after a daring maneuver, outsmarting the English defenses. For the exhausted population and demoralized soldiers, the sight of this young woman, who defied all conventions, was a ray of light amidst the darkness. Many saw her as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the virgin from Lorraine who would come to save France. Joan wasted no time. With surprising energy and authority for someone so young and without military experience, she immediately began to inspect the city's defenses, interact with the soldiers, and question the commanders about their tactics. Her presence was not merely symbolic. She brought a palpable determination and an unwavering belief in divine victory. There was resistance from some experienced captains who saw her as an inexperienced intruder and dismissed her visions as delusions. They even tried to carry out military operations without consulting her, or by giving her misleading information about their plans. However, the force of her personality and the faith she inspired in the people and soldiers quickly overcame the resistance. Joan's arrival generated a mixture of curiosity and, more importantly, a new wave of hope. If this story, full of miracles and turning points, has surprised and inspired you, then don't hesitate to leave your like on this video. This helps us spread this fascinating knowledge and bring Joan of Arc's story to even more people. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our next episodes about history's most epic figures. And if you want to show your support, share this video with your friends and family, so together we can spread knowledge. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We want to know how far Joan of Arc's story reaches. Her arrival in Orléans was not just a military event. It was the beginning of a psychological and spiritual transformation, a moment when the flame of hope, which seemed extinguished, reignited with overwhelming intensity, setting the stage for one of the greatest military reversals in history. Joan of Arc's arrival in Orléans, described in the previous topic, was not just a milestone. It was the prelude to one of the most spectacular military reversals in history. The city, besieged for months, was on the verge of capitulation. The English, confident in their superiority and French demoralization, were simply awaiting the final collapse. However, Joan's entry completely changed the dynamic of the siege. She was not a trained general, but her tactical intuition and her ability to inspire troops were unparalleled. Joan, with her contagious energy and her standard at the forefront, immediately instilled a new spirit. She insisted on direct and audacious attacks against the English fortifications, something the French commanders had avoided for months, preferring skirmish tactics and passive defense. The first major assault under her leadership occurred on May 4, 1429, against the Bastille of Saint-Lô, a crucial English fortification east of the city. Joan, defying the caution of the other captains, personally led the troops. Although she was wounded in battle, an arrow struck her shoulder, though she minimized the pain to not discourage her men. Her presence on the front lines inspired the soldiers. They fought with renewed ferocity, and the Bastille was quickly taken. The victory was a shock to the English and a huge morale boost for the French. The climax of the liberation of Orléans came with the assault on the Tourelle fortification, a fortified tower guarding the bridge over the Loire, on May 7th. It was the most important English position, and its capture was essential to break the siege. Joan, once again, was at the forefront. Despite an arrow wound to her neck, she refused to retreat, and her persistence inspired the French soldiers to a final effort. Witnesses of the time report that she seemed endowed with supernatural energy, shouting encouragements and leading the most dangerous charges. The fight was brutal and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. However, French determination, infused by Joan's presence, was decisive. The English at the Tourelles, isolated and without hope of reinforcements, were crushed. The fall of the Tourelles and the subsequent English retreat from Orléans on May 8, 1429, were considered a true miracle. In just 9 days, Joan of Arc had reversed the course of a siege that seemed lost, demonstrating not only bravery, but an intuitive strategic capacity that surprised everyone. The victory in Orléans was a watershed moment in the 100 Years' War. It not only saved the French monarchy from annihilation, but also proved, in the eyes of many, the divine nature of Joan's mission. She had fulfilled the first part of her prophecy, and her fame spread throughout France, making her the Maid of Orléans, a living symbol of hope and an omen that the tide of the war was finally turning. With the liberation of Orléans, Joan of Arc rapidly ascended from an eccentric religious figure to a legendary heroine, known throughout France as the Maid of Orléans. This title was not merely an epithet, it was a popular consecration, a recognition that she had achieved the impossible. The city of Orléans, which had received her with a mixture of skepticism and despair, now venerated her as a savior. News of her victory spread like wildfire, traveling through villages and towns, igniting hope where before there had only been resignation. The psychological impact of Joan's figure was immense, both for the French and for the English. For the French, Joan represented divine intervention. In a deeply religious era, the idea that God had sent a virgin to save their kingdom was powerful and mobilizing. Soldiers, who had previously been demoralized and fled the battlefield, now fought with renewed fervor, believing that the very hand of God guided them through Joan. Troop morale soared. Doubt and fear were replaced by contagious optimism. She was seen not only as a military leader but as a talisman, a herald of inevitable victories. Joan's mere presence on the battlefield was enough to inspire troops to acts of bravery that had previously seemed unattainable. The men, who at first might have scoffed at a woman in war, came to admire her and follow her with devotion, seeing in her purity and courage a reflection of the justice of their cause. On the English side, Joan's fame generated a mixture of fear and superstition. For many, she was a witch, a creature of the devil whose dark powers were responsible for the inexplicable turnaround in Orléans. English propaganda tried to delegitimize her, but Joan's own effectiveness on the battlefield made these accusations difficult to sustain. The belief that they were fighting against supernatural forces corroded the morale of English soldiers, who, accustomed to easy victories, now found themselves facing a force that seemed invincible. The mere mention of her name could cause panic among English patrols. The Maid of Orléans became a symbol of resilience and faith. Her story of an illiterate peasant girl who defied social and military norms to save her country resonated deeply with common people. She proved that courage and faith could come from anywhere, not just from nobility. Her impact transcended the military. She restored a nation's confidence in itself and its destiny. The legend of Joan of Arc began to be forged, not just in songs and stories, but in the tangible victories she continued to win, paving the way for the next crucial step of her mission, the coronation of the Dauphin in Reims. After the miraculous victory at Orléans, French confidence in Joan of Arc reached unprecedented levels. Orléans had been only the first step of her divine mission. The next was to consolidate Dauphin Charles VII's position and, crucially, to open the way for his coronation in Reims, the traditional city for French royal coronations, which was in enemy territory. To do this, Joan proposed a daring military campaign along the Loire Valley, aiming to liberate the fortified cities still under English or Allied control. This campaign was essential to protect Orléans from future attacks and to ensure the security of the route to Reims. Initially, some of Charles VII's advisors and generals, still adhering to more defensive and cautious tactics, resisted Joan's aggressive plans. They preferred to consolidate gains and avoid unnecessary risks. However, Joan, driven by her voices and the urgency of her mission, insisted on moving forward. Her determination, combined with the growing fervor she inspired in the troops, eventually prevailed over the court's hesitation. Charles VII, once again, yielded to her conviction, realizing that the Maid was the only real hope for progress. The Loire campaign, which unfolded in June 1429, was a series of quick and decisive victories that demonstrated not only Joan's bravery, but also her intuitive capacity for battlefield leadership. Key cities along the river, such as Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, fell successively under the French attack, led by Joan and her now loyal captains, like John II of Alençon. The battles were intense, but Joan's presence at the vanguard, with her standard infused superhuman courage into the French soldiers. In Jargeau, for example, Joan led the final charge against the walls, being hit in the head by a catapult stone, but getting up and exhorting her men to continue. The fall of Jargeau was swift and violent, with heavy English losses. These victories were not just military, they were psychological. The English, demoralized by the defeat at Orléans and the aura of invincibility surrounding Joan, began to show signs of weakness. Their garrisons were isolated and fearful, and the belief in English invincibility was being broken. The Loire campaign would culminate in the Battle of Patay, where the English relief army would be annihilated, definitively opening the way for Charles VII's coronation. The Loire campaign was crucial for legitimizing Joan as a military leader and for solidifying confidence in her mission. It proved that Orléans had not been a fluke. Each victory reinforced the idea that God was, indeed, on France's side, and that the Maid was his instrument. With the Loire Valley secured, the dream of coronation in Reims, once a distant utopia, now seemed an achievable reality, a vital step to restore the sovereignty and dignity of the French kingdom. The Battle of Patay, fought on June 18, 1429, was the culmination of the Loire campaign and one of the most decisive French victories of the entire Hundred Years' War, directly influenced by Joan of Arc's presence and vision. After the series of French successes along the Loire, the English commanders, led by John Talbot, one of their most experienced and feared generals, decided to gather their forces to halt the French advance towards Reims. Talbot's objective was to intercept Charles VII's army, now marching with Joan, and restore English military supremacy. The English army, though smaller in number, relied on its legendary longbowmen, who had been the bane of French cavalry in previous battles like Agincourt. They were preparing to mount a strong defense, using their pointed stakes to deter cavalry charges. However, Joan of Arc's impulsiveness and faith, along with the audacity of the French commanders who now followed her, would change the scenario. The French army, led by generals like La Hire and Jean II of Alençon, under Joan's inspiration, was in fervent pursuit of the English. The element of surprise played a crucial role at Patay. While the English archers were in the process of planting their defensive stakes, a stag appeared on the field, startled by the noise of the armies. The English archers, not yet fully prepared for combat, let out a shout that alerted the French vanguard, led by the cavalry. Joan of Arc, who was at the forefront alongside her generals, did not hesitate. She insisted that the advantage should be exploited immediately. "Do you have your spurs? Mount and charge," she reportedly exclaimed, showing her urgency to seize the opportunity. "The English are ours. God has delivered them into our hands." Although the prophecy of the stag is a popular anecdote, its essence, the sudden opportunity and decisive attack, reflects how the battle unfolded. The French cavalry, previously so hesitant, launched a devastating charge before the English could complete their defensive formations. The archers, caught off guard and without their protections, were quickly overwhelmed. The battle turned into a rout, with the English suffering heavy losses. John Talbot and other English commanders were captured. The Battle of Patay was an overwhelming victory for the French, which annihilated a significant part of the English army and broke the myth of the archers' invincibility. The result of Patay unequivocally opened the way for Charles VII's coronation in Reims. No substantial English force remained to impede the march. The battle solidified Joan of Arc's reputation as a divinely inspired military leader, and her presence continued to instill fear in the hearts of her enemies and hope in those of her allies. The road to Reims was now clear, and the destiny of France seemed, for the first time in decades, to be in the right hands. With the victories of the Loire campaign culminating in the decisive Battle of Patay, the path to Charles VII's coronation in Reims, the ancestral city of French royal coronations, was finally clear. However, the march to Reims was not a simple procession. It was an audacious move and, for many of the Dauphin's advisors, a risky one. Reims was in the heart of territory controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English, and the logistics of moving a large army through hostile lands presented an immense challenge. The presence of the Maid of Orléans, however, was the factor that transformed the unthinkable into the possible. Joan of Arc, driven by her voices which insisted on the urgency of the coronation to legitimize Charles VII, was the main proponent of this march. She understood the symbolic and political value of crowning the king in the traditional location, an affirmation of his divine and earthly sovereignty over all of France. The coronation in Reims, rather than in a safer city in the south, would be a demonstration of strength and right. She believed that God's will was in her favor, and that resistance would be broken by the simple manifestation of faith and truth. The march began on June 29, 1429. The royal army, accompanied by Joan, departed from Gien on the Loire. In every city they encountered along the way, Joan's presence had an almost magical effect. Troyes, Chalons, Auxerre, fortified cities that could have resisted for months, opened their gates without major combat, often after negotiations in which Joan's reputation and popular fervor played a crucial role. In some cases, the Burgundian or English garrisons simply abandoned their positions, demoralized by the Maid's fame and the belief in her supernatural powers. There were moments of tension, such as during the siege of Troy. The city, well fortified, resisted surrender. Charles VII's advisors suggested retreating, but Joan, with her unwavering faith, promised victory in a few days. She staged an aggressive show of force, and in an incredibly short time, the city surrendered, almost without bloodshed. The success in Troy further reinforced the belief in Joan's providence and silenced the skeptics within the court. The march to Reims was not a military conquest in the traditional sense with major battles. It was a psychological and political victory, where Joan of Arc's aura and the fear she inspired in her enemies, combined with the hope she rekindled in the French, were the most powerful weapons. The progression of the royal army through enemy territory, without major obstacles, was a visible proof that the tide of the war had turned. The triumphant entry into Reims on July 16, 1429, was the culmination of this epic journey, setting the stage for the moment that would seal the destiny of the French monarchy and Joan of Arc's place in history. On July 17, 1429, the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Reims, a stage for centuries of French royal coronations, witnessed an event that seemed impossible just months before: the consecration of Charles VII as King of France. This was not merely a ritual, it was an act of profound political and religious significance, which restored the legitimacy of the French monarchy in a moment of existential crisis. And at the heart of this ceremony, beside the king, stood Joan of Arc, in her white armor, with her standard fulfilling the second and most crucial part of her divine mission. For Charles VII, the coronation in Reims was essential. By the Treaty of Troyes, he had been disinherited in favor of the English king, and his authority was questioned throughout much of the kingdom. Being crowned in Bourges, his refuge, would not have carried the same symbolic weight. Reims was the place where French kings received sacred anointing, a rite that conferred upon them an aura of divinity and the inalienable right to the throne. The presence of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, who had led the army through enemy lands to make the coronation possible, lent the ceremony an air of miracle and unquestionable divine validation. The atmosphere in the cathedral was one of triumph and emotion. The people of Reims and the French soldiers, who had witnessed the impressive march of the army, were filled with fervor. Joan was positioned in a place of honor, beside the king. She did not kneel before him like the other nobles, but remained standing with her standard, symbolizing that the king's authority was now also a manifestation of divine will, expressed through her. During the ceremony, Charles VII was anointed with the sacred oil from the holy ampulla, a ritual that dated back to the legend of Clovis, the first king of the Franks. The legitimacy of his reign was now unequivocally sealed. After the anointing, Joan, according to witnesses, knelt at Charles VII's feet, stating, "Gentle king, now the will of God has been fulfilled, who commanded me to lift the siege of Orléans, and bring you to this city of Reims to receive your sacred coronation, showing that you are the true king and the one to whom the kingdom of France must belong." This direct, simple yet impactful speech encapsulated her entire mission. The coronation was a devastating blow to English and Burgundian propaganda. It delegitimized English claims to the French throne and gave Charles VII the moral and divine authority he so desperately needed. The event not only united the French around their king, but also provided a new impetus to continue the fight against the invaders. With the anointing in Reims, Charles VII ceased to be the King of Bourges and became, in every sense, the King of France. Joan of Arc's role in this historic moment was recognized by all. She had fulfilled her prophecy and delivered the crown to her king, solidifying her place in history as the savior of the kingdom. From this point, the focus of the war would shift from a desperate defense to territorial reconquest. After the coronation in Reims, Joan of Arc reached the peak of her glory and popular recognition. She was acclaimed as a heroine, a living saint, and her name was synonymous with hope and victory throughout loyal France. Dauphin Charles VII, now anointed king, expressed his gratitude, granting lands and titles to Joan's family, an unprecedented recognition for a peasant. The people viewed her with reverence, and the soldiers followed her with an almost fanatical devotion, firmly believing in her invincibility and divine protection. However, glory brought with it the seeds of future disagreements and challenges. While Joan yearned to continue the campaign, following what her voices instructed her, to march to Paris and expel the English from the entire kingdom, the royal court and King Charles VII's advisors had other priorities and strategies. The coronation in Reims had satisfied the king's main objective, his legitimation. Now, he and his advisors, led by figures like Georges de la Trémoille, a favorite of the king and a shrewd but risk-averse politician, preferred a more cautious approach. They sought diplomatic negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, hoping to separate him from the English alliance, which would be a victory without the need for further bloodshed. This strategic divergence created growing tension between Joan and the court. Joan was a woman of action, driven by a faith that tolerated no half measures. She saw negotiations as a waste of time, a deviation from divine will. For her, the mission was clear: expel the English. Her generals, like Jean Lequin of Alençon, who admired and supported her, often agreed with her audacity, but were limited by the crown's orders. Joan's influence over the king gradually began to wane. Charles VII, a man who preferred caution and diplomacy, found Joan's impulsiveness difficult to manage. Furthermore, her massive popularity and the widespread belief in her divine connection, while initially useful for the king, could now be seen as a veiled threat to his own authority. A king needed to be seen as the sole intermediary between God and the kingdom, and a peasant woman who spoke directly with God could, ironically, undermine royal authority in the long run. Intrigues at court also intensified. Some nobles, envious of Joan's fame and influence, or simply suspicious of her humble origins and her powers, began to sow doubts about her. La Trémoille himself saw Joan as an obstacle to his own plans and interests. Joan's glory was, paradoxically, beginning to attract the clouds of her downfall. Joan's political naivete, combined with the complexity and hypocrisy of the court, placed her in a vulnerable position. Although she was still revered by the people, the lack of unified court support and the growing strategic divergences prepared her for the challenges to come, marking the beginning of a less triumphant phase of her journey. After Charles VII's coronation in Reims, Joan of Arc's passion for expelling the English from France propelled her to a new objective: the capture of Paris. For Joan, the capital was the heart of the kingdom, and its liberation would be the final step in fulfilling the entirety of her divine mission. However, the attempt to conquer Paris in September 1429 proved to be a disastrous turning point and exposed the growing divergences between Joan's audacity and the royal court's caution. Joan, with her unwavering faith, believed that the city, like so many others along the march to Reims, would surrender to the mere presence of the king and his army, blessed by God. She pressured Charles VII to march directly to the capital, but the king and his advisors, including the influential Georges de la Trémoille, hesitated. They preferred diplomacy, especially ongoing negotiations with Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, which promised a truce and the possible surrender of Paris without bloodshed. The truth is, the court feared a prolonged and costly campaign against a city as well fortified and garrisoned as Paris, which was under strong Anglo-Burgundian control. Despite the king's hesitations, Joan gained permission for an attack, but with limited and reluctant support. The siege of Paris began on September 8, 1429. Joan, with her standard at the forefront, personally led the assault against the Porte de Saint-Honoré, one of the city's main entrances. She was in the vanguard, shouting encouragement and urging her men to scale the walls. However, Paris's defenses were formidable, and Anglo-Burgundian resistance was fierce. The French forces faced showers of arrows, stones, and boiling oil. Joan was wounded in the thigh by an arrow, an injury that, though not fatal, forced her to withdraw from the front line. Although she insisted on continuing the attack the next day, the lack of support from the rest of the army, which received no clear orders for reinforcement, and the hasty withdrawal of the siege ladders by court orders, doomed the assault. The retreat was chaotic and disorganized. For Joan, the failure in Paris was a hard blow. She had promised victory, and her voices, which had previously guided her so precisely, now seemed to fall silent or give instructions that were not followed by the court. The failed siege of Paris marked a turning point in her relationship with Charles VII. The king and his advisors blamed Joan for the haste and failure, using the incident to justify their policy of caution and negotiations. From that moment on, Joan's influence over the crown's military decisions drastically diminished. She would continue to fight in other skirmishes, but her ability to dictate the overall strategy of the army was severely compromised. Paris did not fall, and the Maid of Orléans, once invincible, suffered her first major setback, a sign that the challenges to come would be more political than purely military. The failure in Paris at the end of 1429 marked the beginning of a period of increasing weariness and isolation for Joan of Arc. The aura of invincibility that surrounded her began to dissipate in the eyes of some, especially at the royal court, who saw her setbacks as validation for their own strategy of caution and negotiation. Joan's unwavering faith and her incessant insistence on an aggressive military campaign to definitively expel the English clashed with Charles VII's preference and his advisors for truces and diplomatic agreements, often under the influence of figures like Georges de la Trémoille. Intrigues at court, which had previously been whispers, became more audible. Joan's enemies, especially those who envied her fame and influence, or who simply felt threatened by her meteoric rise, took advantage of the setback in Paris to intensify suspicions and slanders against her. Accusations of presumption, disrespect for established military authority, and even arrogance began to be leveled. For many nobles, the idea of a humble woman wielding such power was an affront to the established social order. Furthermore, Joan continued to participate in skirmishes and small campaigns throughout the winter and spring of 1430, but the momentum of the spectacular victories at Orléans and the march to Reims had waned. She was increasingly on her own, often with limited logistical and military support. Her voices, which had previously guided her with such clarity, now seemed less decisive in terms of military strategy, or perhaps the court was simply unwilling to listen to them. This led to moments of frustration, and at times to decisions that were interpreted as imprudent by the more skeptical. Joan herself felt the weight of this weariness. In a letter, she expressed her desire to be sent back home after the coronation, a sign that the court's pressure and growing ingratitude were affecting her. However, her voices compelled her to continue her mission. The Maid of Orléans, who had been the great hope, now found herself in an increasingly precarious position. She was a divine instrument, but also a piece on the complex political chessboard of the French court, and her purity and lack of malice in dealing with intrigues made her vulnerable. The seeds of her tragedy were being sown. Joan's popularity among the people, though still strong, was not enough to protect her from the court's machinations and the king's political pragmatism, who, having achieved his main objective of coronation, no longer saw the same urgency in keeping Joan in a leadership position. The stage was set for the betrayal and capture that would soon come. with the court's suspicions paving the way for her eventual fate. Amidst the growing weariness at court and the diminishing of her influence, Joan of Arc, with her deep connection to the divine, reportedly made a series of predictions about her own capture. These prophecies, which are widely mentioned in her interrogations during the trial and in later accounts by her companions, reveal an awareness of the imminent danger and a stoic acceptance of her fate, though without rigorous historical proof of their pre-event accuracy. It is believed that her voices had repeatedly warned her about her eventual imprisonment, indicating that she would be captured before the feast of St. John the Baptist in June. These premonitions were not vague. Joan is said to have communicated them to her confidants and even publicly on various occasions. For example, in Compiègne, before the final siege, she reportedly told her soldiers, "There will be betrayal against me, and I will be delivered and soon taken." I do not know when or where. She did not specify the exact day or time, but the conviction in her voice was unwavering. This apparent prescience added a layer of mystery and sacrifice to her figure. For her followers, it was further proof of her divine connection. For her enemies, perhaps a sign of her madness or a pact with evil. The nature of these prophecies is a topic of debate among historians. Some view them as a reflection of her keen intuition and knowledge of the political and military tensions around her, knowing that her audacity placed her in constant risk. Others interpret them as a mythical element added later to her legend, to reinforce her sanctity and the sacrificial nature of her death. Nevertheless, in contemporary accounts, Joan's belief in her own imminent capture was very real. She did not seek to avoid her fate, but rather to face it with the same courage with which she had led her troops in battle. This acceptance of what was to come, though painful, underscores the depth of her faith. Joan believed that her imprisonment and even her death were part of the divine plan, a necessary sacrifice for the redemption of France. She did not fight against this prophecy, but embraced it as part of her mission. This aspect of her story humanizes the legendary figure, showing a young woman who, despite her strength and conviction, bore the burden of a tragic destiny. The imminence of her capture, which she seemed to foresee, adds a layer of fatalistic inevitability to the events that would follow, paving the way for the ambush at Compiègne and the tragic end of her journey. Joan of Arc's prediction about her own capture tragically materialized in the Battle of Compiègne on May 23, 1430. After months of frustration with the court's inaction and the failure of truce negotiations with the Burgundians, Joan, driven by her combative spirit and her voices, decided to act on her own to defend the city of Compiègne, which was under Anglo-Burgundian siege. The city was loyal to Charles VII, and its fall would represent a severe blow to France. Joan's intervention in Compiègne once again demonstrated her courage and willingness to fight, even when the court seemed hesitant. She entered the city with a small group of men, reinforcing the garrison and boosting the defenders' morale. However, Joan's plan to launch a surprise attack against the besieging English and Burgundian forces was flawed in its execution. In a daring sortie, she led a troop to attack a Burgundian position. The initial assault had some success, but the enemy forces quickly reorganized and launched a massive counterattack. What followed was chaos. Joan's forces were forced to retreat in disarray, pushed towards the city's drawbridge. The bridge, crucial for the retreat, was prematurely raised by orders from the governor of Compiègne, Guillaume de Flavy, leaving Joan and her few men isolated on the battlefield, exposed to the enemy. Although historical sources do not confirm Flavy's intentional betrayal, the action was interpreted by many at the time, and by later historians, as a deliberate act of abandonment or even betrayal, possibly motivated by jealousy of her fame, fear of her influence, or tacit orders from the court that wished to see her out of the way. "Fear not, my friends, it is the will of God," she reportedly cried out to her men as they retreated, according to some accounts, showing her faith even in the moment of extreme danger. But the situation was untenable. Surrounded and outnumbered, Joan fought bravely but was knocked from her horse by an archer. On the ground, she was surrounded by Burgundian soldiers. A Picard archer named Lionel was credited with her capture. Joan of Arc, the invincible Maid of Orléans, was finally in the hands of her enemies. Joan's capture was a devastating blow to French morale and an immense propaganda victory for the English and their Burgundian allies. For them, it meant that God had turned against France, and that the witch or heretic who had plagued their armies was finally under their control. For Joan, it was the beginning of her ordeal, a period of captivity, trial, and martyrdom, which she, in her own words, had predicted. The betrayal at Compiègne was not just a military event, it was a turning point that removed her from the battlefield and placed her in a judicial setting where her faith and her life would be put to the test. News of Joan of Arc's capture in Compiègne spread rapidly throughout France and England, eliciting diametrically opposed reactions. For the French loyal to Dauphin Charles VII, it was a shock and a deep discouragement. The hope embodied by the Maid seemed to have been extinguished. For the English and their Burgundian allies, Joan's capture was an unprecedented victory, an invaluable prize they were determined to exploit to the fullest. She was not just an ordinary prisoner of war, she was the symbol of their recent series of defeats, the figure who had revitalized French morale and demoralized English troops. The capture of high-value prisoners was a common practice in medieval warfare, and they could be exchanged for other captives, or, more frequently, for a substantial ransom in money. Joan of Arc's value was incalculable, not only for her symbolism, but also for the fervent desire of the English to discredit her, and thereby undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was Joan's captor, and he saw in her an opportunity for profit and revenge. The English, eager to get Joan into their hands for a trial that would condemn her for heresy and witchcraft, thus unmasking her as an impostor and, by extension, invalidating Charles VII's coronation in Reims, were willing to pay an exorbitant price. After negotiations, Joan's ransom price was agreed upon at 10,000 livres tournois, a princely sum for the time, equivalent to the ransom of a royal prince. This colossal amount demonstrated the strategic importance the English attributed to her capture and subsequent condemnation. It is crucial to note that, throughout this period of negotiations, Charles VII made no significant effort to rescue Joan. This omission is one of the most controversial and painful points in Joan of Arc's history. Some historians argue that the king was financially and politically weakened. Others suggest that he and his advisors, especially La Trémoille, saw Joan's capture as an opportunity to rid themselves of a figure who had become uncontrollable and politically inconvenient. Joan's presence, with her visions and her demand for constant military action, was an annoyance to a court that preferred diplomacy and caution. Joan's sale to the English, therefore, was an act of political and financial pragmatism on the part of the Burgundians, and of convenience for the English, who aimed to use her as an instrument to undermine the French monarchy. For Joan, the price of her ransom was her own freedom and ultimately her life. She was transferred to Rouen in Normandy, then under English control, where she would be subjected to a trial whose verdict was already predetermined, a parody of justice designed to destroy not only a woman, but a symbol. The high price paid for her capture was a testament to her power, a power her enemies wished to annihilate. After being sold to the English, Joan of Arc was transferred to Rouen in Normandy, one of the main centers of English power in France. There she was not treated as a common prisoner of war, but as a dangerous criminal, accused of heresy and witchcraft. Her captivity, which lasted several months, was marked by conditions of extreme insecurity and isolation, designed to undermine her morale, her faith, and her sanity before the impending trial. Joan was held in a cell in the Beauvreuil castle in Rouen, under the guard of English soldiers. Unlike prisoners of war of her status, who were usually held in more dignified conditions and under the custody of civil guards or nobles, Joan was kept in a tower, chained and constantly watched by soldiers who did not see her as a woman, but as a witch or an anomaly. Historical sources, while not proving systematic physical torture, suggest an environment of constant psychological pressure. She was subjected to humiliation, mockery, and, most seriously, the persistent threat of sexual violence. To protect herself, Joan insisted on continuing to wear her men's clothing, a tight doublet and hose tied with laces, which hindered aggression and protected her from the temptation of sins that could compromise her purity, and consequently, her claim of saintliness and the divine nature of her voices. This choice, counterintuitive for the time, would be one of the pillars of her accusation of heresy during the trial. Her captivity was a prison not only physical but spiritual. She was denied the right to have female companions in her cell, a request she repeatedly made, to avoid accusations or embarrassing situations that could be used against her. Her guards sometimes tried to provoke her, laughing at her visions and her faith. The objective was to break her spirit even before the trial began, forcing her to confess crimes or renounce her beliefs. Despite her vulnerability and isolation, Joan remained remarkably firm in her faith. She continued to hear her voices, which comforted her and prepared her for the challenges of the trial. She knew she was in mortal danger, but she showed no fear, only a serene resignation to what she considered to be God's will. Joan's captivity was not just an imprisonment. It was a cruel stage of her ordeal, where her resilience and devotion were tested to the limit, shaping her determination for the final confrontation that awaited her in court. Each day of captivity reinforced the need for a trial, not only to condemn her, but to dismantle the belief in her divine mission, and, by extension, in the legitimacy of King Charles VII. Joan of Arc's trial, which formally began on February 21, 1431 in Rouen, was one of history's greatest judicial farces. It was not an impartial search for truth or justice, but a political trial disguised as an ecclesiastical inquisition, meticulously orchestrated by the English with the goal of discrediting Joan, proving her to be a heretic or witch, and thereby undermining the legitimacy of Charles VII's coronation. If Joan were condemned for witchcraft, the king's anointing through her intercession would be invalidated, and Charles VII himself would be associated with demonic forces. The main architect of this tribunal was Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a fierce ally of the English and an ambitious clergyman who played the role of Joan's primary tormentor. Cochon, who had been expelled from his diocese by French forces loyal to the Dauphin, had a personal interest in Joan's condemnation. He presided over the tribunal and carefully selected the jurors, over 100 French clerics, theologians, and jurists, almost all of whom were sympathetic to the English, or under their strong influence and pressure. Impartiality was an illusion. The verdict was, for the most part, predetermined. The tribunal sessions took place in various locations within Rouen, including the royal chapel of Rouen Castle, and even Joan's own cell, a tactic to wear her down. Joan was denied access to a defense lawyer, a right denied to her under the pretext that she was being tried by an ecclesiastical court. She was forced to defend herself alone against a bench of educated and cunning men, trained in canon law and the art of rhetoric. The trial records, which were kept by several scribes, are the main source of our knowledge about the process, though the interpretation of their accuracy is debated by historians. The interrogations were exhaustive and cunning, designed to trap Joan in contradictions, or to force her to make statements that could be interpreted as heretical. Questions ranged from trivial details of her childhood to complex theological issues about the nature of her visions, the authority of the Church, and the validity of her mission. The tribunal accused her of witchcraft for her supposed ability to predict events, and for her inexplicable military success, and of heresy for her male clothing and for claiming direct communication with God, allegedly ignoring the authority of the Church. Despite the immense pressure and the absence of legal support, Joan demonstrated remarkable intelligence, insight, and firmness in her responses, often outwitting her own interrogators. She refused to bow to doctrines she did not understand, or that contradicted her faith, maintaining her conviction that her voices were divine. Joan of Arc's trial was not about her guilt or innocence. It was about power, propaganda, and the annihilation of a symbol that threatened English hegemony in France. It was a human hunt under the guise of religious justice. At the heart of the cruel judicial spectacle that was Joan of Arc's trial stood the figure of Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais. Far from being an impartial judge, Cochon was a man deeply involved in Anglo-Burgundian politics, a shrewd and ambitious cleric who played the role of Joan's primary tormentor. His determination to condemn her was as fierce as Joan's own faith. Cochon was a renowned theologian and jurist, with vast experience at the University of Paris, a bastion of pro-English thought at the time. He had politically aligned himself with the English and with the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good. When Joan was captured in Compiègne, which was within the boundaries of his diocese of Beauvais, Cauchon immediately claimed the right to try her. Although Joan had been captured by Burgundian forces and sold to the English, Cauchon insisted that, since she had allegedly committed heresies in his territory, jurisdiction over the case belonged to him. This claim, though technically questionable, was accepted by the English, who saw in Cauchon the perfect instrument for their purposes. Cauchon's motivation was multifaceted. First, there was political loyalty to the Anglo-Burgundian faction. Condemning Joan for heresy and witchcraft would serve to discredit Charles VII's coronation in Reims and delegitimize his ascent to the throne, which had been largely made possible by the Maid. Second, there was personal ambition. Cauchon hoped to be rewarded by the English with higher ecclesiastical positions, possibly the Archbishopric of Rouen, a city under English control. Third, there may have been a genuine, albeit distorted, religious zeal. For Cauchon and many of his contemporaries, Joan's claims of direct communication with God, bypassing the church hierarchy, could be seen as dangerous and heretical, especially if she were inspired by evil forces. Throughout the trial, Cauchon demonstrated blatant partiality. He presided over the sessions, formulated cunning questions, manipulated the process, and suppressed any evidence or testimony that might favor Joan. He denied her the right to a lawyer, ignored her appeals for a fair trial before the Pope, and frequently interrupted her answers when they became inconvenient for the prosecution. He even manipulated the transcriptions of her words, omitting or altering parts to make them appear more condemnatory. Cauchon was, therefore, the engine behind the judicial machine that aimed to annihilate Joan. His intelligence and methodical cruelty made him the perfect antagonist to Joan's simple and unwavering faith. He saw Joan not as an innocent young woman, but as a political and religious threat that needed to be eradicated. Pierre Cauchon's role is a grim reminder of how justice can be perverted when politics and personal ambition override truth. His relentless pursuit of Joan of Arc's condemnation immortalized him as an infamous figure in history. Joan of Arc's trial in Rouen was an intricate tangle of theological, political, and social accusations, orchestrated to ensure her condemnation. The process formalized 70 articles of accusation, which were later reduced to 12 more concise ones, all aiming to frame her as a heretic, apostate, idolater, or witch. The main accusations revolved around three pillars: her visions and voices, considered a direct communication with God that disregarded the authority of the church, her use of men's clothing, a violation of church law, and an act considered against nature for a woman, and her refusal to fully submit to the authority of the tribunal, claiming she answered only to God. The interrogations were extensive, lasting weeks, and conducted by a panel of ecclesiastical judges trained in rhetoric and canon law, all of whom were inclined towards condemnation. The questions were cunning, seeking to trap her. For example, she was asked if she knew she was in a state of grace. A yes answer would be presumptuous, a sin of pride. A no would indicate that she could not receive divine messages. Joan, with her innate shrewdness, replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." This answer, which became famous, disarmed her inquisitors and demonstrated her intelligence and faith. She was accused of witchcraft and sorcery, with the accusation that her military victories were the work of black magic, not divine intervention. The unwavering courage she instilled in the troops and the panic she generated in the enemies were attributed to demonic pacts. Joan vigorously defended herself, insisting that her voices were from God and his saints, and that her actions were guided by divine providence and not by pacts with the devil. "My brothers in God, believe what I tell you," she declared at one point in frustration, trying to convey the truth of her faith. The issue of male clothing was particularly thorny. Although Joan initially wore them for protection on the battlefield and in her captivity, the tribunal saw them as a transgression of divine and ecclesiastical laws, a sign that she defied the natural order and Christian morality for women. Joan defended herself by claiming she wore them by divine command to protect her virginity among men, and that this was necessary for her mission. Her refusal to abandon them, even under pressure, was an act of defiance that the tribunal considered heretical. Joan was also questioned about her obedience to the church. She stated that she obeyed the Church of God, but that her voices came directly from God, and that she could not disobey God in favor of the tribunal. For her judges, this distinction was blasphemy, a direct challenge to the authority of the visible church. Despite her youth, illiteracy, and lack of legal training, Joan displayed remarkable firmness and lucidity in her responses. She did not yield to pressure, nor did she contradict herself easily. Her defense was the simplicity of her faith and her unwavering conviction in her mission. Although she knew the trial was a sham, her dignity and courage in facing her accusers ensured that her legacy of faith remained untouched, even in the face of imminent condemnation. Among the various accusations leveled against Joan of Arc in her trial, one stood out for its controversy and the symbolic weight it carried for the mentality of the time: Joan's insistence on wearing men's clothing. For the ecclesiastical tribunal, this was not merely a matter of attire, but a crucial point of heresy and subversion of the social and divine order. It was a direct affront to gender norms and the teachings of the church, which dictated that men and women should dress according to their sex, based on biblical passages like Deuteronomy 22:5, which forbids women from wearing men's clothes. From the very beginning of her journey, Joan had adopted male attire, a choice that, for her, was both practical and divinely inspired. She argued that men's clothes were essential for her safety on the battlefield and during her travels, protecting her from harassment and sexual assault in a male-dominated environment. Furthermore, she claimed that her celestial voices had instructed her to dress this way for her mission. "All that I have done has been by the order of God and of his angels," she reportedly affirmed, justifying her choice. For her, this attire was an intrinsic part of her identity as a warrior and divine messenger, an outfit that liberated her from feminine conventions and allowed her to fulfill her role as a military leader. However, for the tribunal, this was a grave transgression seen as a sign of rebellion against the church, and worse, as proof of her connection with the devil. It was believed that wearing clothes of the opposite sex was a practice associated with witches and heretics, a challenge to the natural and divine order. It was an act of abomination that questioned her morality and, consequently, the purity of her visions. Joan's virginity was crucial for her legitimization as a virgin savior, but the use of male clothing seemed to contradict this purity in the eyes of her inquisitors, especially if she did it for pleasure or vanity. The tribunal repeatedly insisted that Joan renounce male clothing and return to wearing female attire as a sign of submission to the church. At one point in the trial, under immense pressure and with the promise of having her life spared and being transferred to a women's prison, Joan even signed an abjuration, agreeing to wear female clothes. However, her faith and conviction led her to resume male clothing a few days later. Perhaps due to coercion in captivity, her guards may have removed her female clothes, forcing her to wear male ones, or due to a deep regret of her abjuration. This relapse was interpreted by the tribunal as an act of apostasy, proof that she had returned to her heresy and that there was no hope of salvation for her. The issue of male clothing, therefore, was not just a detail. It became a symbol of Joan's intransigence and the tribunal's determination to condemn her, largely sealing her tragic fate. Joan of Arc's trial was a marathon of psychological torture, designed to break her resistance and force a confession that would delegitimize her mission, and, by extension, Charles VII's coronation. For months, Joan was subjected to exhaustive interrogations, often lasting hours, during which she was confronted by dozens of experienced clerics and jurists. The questions were cunning, seeking contradictions in her answers about her visions, her obedience to the church, and her military actions. She was isolated, without a lawyer, and under constant surveillance by hostile English guards in her cell. Threats of torture and being burned alive were constantly uttered. The pressure reached its climax on May 24, 1431. After a public sermon in the cemetery square of Saint-Ouen, where she was exposed to the crowd and threatened with the pyre, Joan finally yielded. Faced with the imminent death by fire, one of the most terrifying forms of execution in the Middle Ages, and under the promise of having her life spared and being transferred to a church prison where she would be treated with more clemency, she signed a document of abjuration. This document, whose exact nature is debated, Some claim a short document was read to her, others a lengthy one, meant that she renounced her heresies, especially the claim that her voices came directly from God and agreed to wear female clothing. Her signature, a simple X, as she was illiterate, was a moment of profound vulnerability. Joan, the fearless warrior who had never retreated in battle, finally succumbed to the terror of death and the promise of salvation. For the Inquisitors, it was a monumental victory. They had apparently managed to break the spirit of the Maid, and the abjuration would be used as proof that she was, in fact, a heretic who had repented, and that, therefore, her visions were false. However, this recantation was temporary and fleeting. Joan's faith was stronger than the physical and psychological pressure. The terms of the abjuration were not fulfilled. She was not transferred to a church prison, but returned to her original cell with her English guards. Furthermore, and crucially, her female clothes, which she had promised to wear, were allegedly removed or hidden by her guards, forcing her to resume male clothing. Some accounts from the time, though unproven, suggest that she was even subjected to attempted abuse by the guards, which led her to resume her male clothing as a form of protection. The regret and deep disappointment over the broken promise would soon lead her to reaffirm her faith. Joan's recantation, though brief, is a testament to the immense pressure she was subjected to and the human fragility in the face of death. But her quick revocation demonstrates the indomitable strength of her faith and conviction, which not even the prospect of the pyre could permanently shake. This moment of temporary weakness only highlights the grandeur of her subsequent resilience. Joan of Arc's temporary recantation, motivated by the terror of the pyre and the promise of clemency, lasted no more than a few days. The decision to sign the abjuration was, for her, an act of weakness and a betrayal of her divine mission. However, the judges promised that she would be transferred to an ecclesiastical prison and treated with clemency was not kept. Instead, she was returned to her original cell in Beauvreuil Castle, under the watchful eyes of the same hostile English guards. More than that, according to reports from the rehabilitation processes and some historical sources, her female clothes, which she had promised to wear, were taken from her, and Joan was forced to resume male clothing. This may have been a deliberate trap by the English and her enemies to lead her to a relapse and justify her execution. The prison conditions, the broken promises, and the return of the voices of her saints, who, she claimed, reproached her for her weakness, led Joan to profound regret. She understood that she had prioritized earthly life over divine obedience and the truth of her mission. In an act of supreme courage and reaffirmation of her faith, Joan of Arc publicly revoked her abjuration. When the judges questioned her about why she had resumed wearing male clothing and asserting her visions, she replied with a clarity and conviction that left no doubt. "I did what I did out of fear of the fire," she reportedly said, acknowledging her human weakness. But immediately afterward, with a firm voice, she declared, "I would rather die than renounce what God has made me do." She reaffirmed that her voices were from God, that they guided her, and that she had heard them from the beginning of her mission. "God commanded me, and I will do it. I am of God," she reportedly proclaimed. For the judges, especially Pierre Cochon, this relapse was irrefutable proof of her obstinacy and heresy. They had offered her a chance at salvation, and she had rejected it. The renunciation of her abjuration sealed her fate. According to the ecclesiastical law of the time, a heretic who abjured and then relapsed into their heresies was handed over to the secular arm, the state, for execution, without further right to clemency. Joan's return to her unwavering faith, even in the face of certain death, is one of the most powerful moments in her story. It reveals the depth of her conviction and her moral courage, which surpassed the fear of pain and physical annihilation. She chose the truth of her faith and loyalty to her divine voices, instead of a life of compromise and denial. This final decision, not to abjure, transformed Joan of Arc from a prisoner into a martyr, ensuring that her legacy would not be that of a repentant heretic, but that of a saint who remained faithful to God until the end. With Joan of Arc's refusal to maintain her abjuration and her firm reaffirmation of her visions and divine mission, her fate was sealed. For the ecclesiastical judges led by Pierre Cochon, Joan's relapse into her heresies meant that she was an impenitent heretic, with no chance of redemption through the Church's means. The judicial process, which from the outset had been a farce with a predetermined verdict, now moved towards its inevitable conclusion. There were no more legal loopholes to delay the final sentence. On May 29, 1431, the judges convened for a final deliberation. Despite a few but notable protests from tribunal members who questioned the legality or fairness of the process, protests that were quickly silenced by Cauchon, the majority of the judges, under political pressure and personal ambition, voted for Joan's condemnation. The sentence was formally pronounced on May 30, 1431. She was declared relapsed, i.e., a heretic who had relapsed after abjuring, and therefore was to be handed over to the secular arm for execution. The sentence included accusations of heresy, idolatry, for her visions and what was deemed excessive worship of her saints, and apostasy, for renouncing the Church, and primarily for resuming male clothing. The tribunal, by handing her over to the secular arm, maintained the appearance that the Church was not responsible for the death, but rather for the religious condemnation, transferring responsibility for the execution to the civil authorities, who in Rouen were under English control. This legal maneuver allowed the Church to remain pure from bloodshed. Joan, upon hearing the sentence, reportedly wept bitterly, not out of fear of death itself, but from the injustice and the pain of being abandoned by those who should have protected her. "Ah, Rouen, Rouen," she is said to have exclaimed, lamenting the fate that awaited her in the enemy city. She appealed to God and to divine justice, but her pleas were in vain. Bishop Cauchon, who had orchestrated the entire trial, read the final sentence with a coldness that contrasted with the young woman's despair. Joan of Arc's condemnation was not just the death of a woman, it was a calculated attempt to kill a symbol. The English hoped that her execution would unmask the divine inspiration behind French victories, and ultimately, delegitimize Charles VII's crown. They wanted to extinguish the flame of hope Joan had ignited in the hearts of the French. But ironically, by condemning and executing her, they ultimately transformed her into a martyr, an even more powerful icon than she had been in life. The death sentence was the prelude to her final sacrifice, which would immortalize her in collective memory. The morning of May 30, 1431, dawned grimly over Rouen in Normandy. The city, under English control, prepared for the macabre spectacle of Joan of Arc's execution. The old market square, Place du Vieux Marché, was packed with a curious and tense crowd, citizens of Rouen, English soldiers, nobles, and clerics who had participated in her trial, all there to witness the end of the Maid of Orléans. The pyre was already constructed, a high wooden platform with wood stacked to ensure a quick and complete combustion. Joan was led from prison by an escort of English soldiers. She wore a simple white dress, contrasting with the male clothing she had stubbornly worn until then. Her head was shaved, a sign of her condemnation for heresy. Despite her youth, she was only 19 years old, and the imminent terrifying death, Joan displayed remarkable calm and dignity. She carried a small cross, improvised from 2 twigs, and upon arriving at the square, asked a priest to hold a crucifix so she could see it as she died. Her faith was her only armor in that final moment. Shortly before being tied to the stake, she knelt and prayed, asking forgiveness for her sins, and forgiving those who were condemning her. Witnesses of the time reported that even some of the English soldiers and members of the tribunal were visibly moved by her piety and serenity. Pierre Cauchon, the bishop who had tried her, was present, observing the culmination of his work. As the flames began to rise, Joan cried out loudly, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus!" Her last breath was the name of Christ, a final affirmation of her unwavering faith. The fire consumed her body quickly. The executioners were instructed to burn her body to ashes, and even her internal organs, so that no relics or traces could be used as objects of veneration. Her ashes were then thrown into the Seine River, so that nothing would remain of her. Joan of Arc's execution was an act of extreme cruelty, but also a monumental miscalculation on the part of the English. They hoped that by physically destroying her, they would also destroy her myth and the hope she represented. However, the effect was the opposite. The sight of the young woman burning alive and her pious and courageous death shocked many of those present and served to cement her image as a martyr. One of the English officers, moved by the scene, reportedly exclaimed, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." The pyre of Rouen, instead of being Joan's end, was the beginning of her immortalization, the sacrifice that elevated her to the pantheon of France's greatest heroes and of history. The pyre of Rouen, although intended to silence Joan of Arc forever and annihilate her symbolism, had the opposite effect. It cemented her image as a martyr and eternal heroine, and marked the beginning of the construction of her legend. News of her execution spread throughout Europe, and although the English tried to control the narrative, the story of the young peasant woman who died faithful to her faith and her divine mission began to resonate deeply with the people. The immediate impact of her death was felt in several ways. For the French loyal to King Charles VII, Joan's death was a painful blow, but also a powerful catalyst. She was already seen as an envoy of God in life. In death, she became a sacrificed saint. The cruelty of her execution at the hands of the enemies only reinforced the idea that the French cause was just and that the English were the villains. Soldiers and peasants, who had previously been inspired by her leadership on the battlefield, now drew inspiration from her martyrdom. Legends about her bravery and piety multiplied. Songs and ballads began to be composed in her honor, perpetuating her memory and solidifying her image as the savior of France. She became a rallying cry, a symbol of unwavering resistance against foreign oppression. On the English side, the attempt to delegitimize Charles VII through Joan's condemnation did not achieve the desired success. Although official propaganda portrayed her as a witch, the public execution and the dignified way Joan faced death raised doubts and even regret among some of those present and among the public. The reputation of Pierre Cochon and other judges was also tarnished, with many seeing them as instruments of English evil rather than defenders of the faith. The burning of Joan, instead of suppressing French hope, fueled it even more, transforming her from a controversial figure in life into a figure of national consensus after her death. The legend of Joan of Arc began to form almost immediately. Her life and death were quickly mythologized, taking on epic and supernatural contours. She ceased to be just a person and became an archetype, the pure virgin who, through divine intervention, saves her nation. This process of heroification and sanctification was essential for the future of France. Her memory served to unite a fragmented kingdom, giving it a common symbol of patriotism and faith. The flame that consumed her on the pyre ignited an even greater flame in the soul of the French people, which would continue to burn for centuries, making her one of the most revered figures in their history. The legacy of her death was the resurrection of her spirit in a nation that would finally find its own redemption. Although the legend of Joan of Arc began to form immediately after her death, official recognition of the injustice of her trial would take more than 2 decades to materialize. 25 years after her execution at the stake, Joan's memory cried out for justice, and the Catholic Church, pressured by the now consolidated King Charles VII and Joan's own family, undertook a rehabilitation process. Charles VII, who had hesitated to rescue Joan and who had greatly benefited from her mission, but who was also commanded to be crowned, had a vital interest in clearing her name. If Joan were a heretic or witch, as proclaimed by the English tribunal, then Charles VII's coronation by her hands would be seen as illegitimate, tainted by demonic associations. To consolidate his own reign and ensure the legitimacy of his dynasty, it was imperative that Joan's condemnation be annulled and that her memory be restored as that of a divine, not malevolent figure. In 1450, after the definitive expulsion of the English from Normandy, Pope Nicholas V, and subsequently Pope Calixtus III, were approached with requests to review Joan's case. In 1455, Pope Calixtus III authorized the opening of a new inquiry, known as the rehabilitation process or nullification trial. This new trial was conducted by an ecclesiastical commission presided over by the Archbishop of Reims, Jean Juvenel des Ursins, and other influential clerics. They heard extensive testimonies from over 100 witnesses, including her comrades in arms, her family, neighbors from Domremy, and even some of the clerics who participated in the first trial and who now regretted their role or feared repercussions. The testimonies revealed the manipulation of the first trial, the partiality of the judges, especially Pierre Cochon, who had already died, the procedural irregularities, the English political pressures, and the steadfastness of Joan's faith. The accusations of witchcraft were disproven, and the wearing of male clothing was justified by the need for protection in captivity and on the battlefield, not by heresy. The process lasted several months, gathering a mountain of evidence. Finally, on July 7, 1456, in Rouen, at the same location where she had been condemned, the verdict of the rehabilitation trial was announced. The tribunal declared that the original process against Joan of Arc was full of fraud, calumny, and iniquity. Her condemnation was officially annulled, revoked, and declared null and void. Joan of Arc was proclaimed innocent of all charges, and her memory was restored. This act not only cleared her name, but also solidified her role as a divinely inspired figure in the history of France, paving the way for her eventual canonization. Justice, though late and insufficient to bring Joan back, was a crucial recognition of her sacrifice and the truth of her mission. Joan of Arc's rehabilitation in 1456 was not the end of her story, but rather a new chapter in the construction of her legacy as the French national heroine. With her name cleared by the Church and the French monarchy consolidated and victorious, Joan's figure underwent a gradual process of mythification and popular sanctification, which elevated her far beyond a simple military leader. She became a multifaceted icon, embodying the values most cherished by French identity: faith, patriotism, courage, and the ability to overcome adversity in times of crisis. In the centuries following her death, Joan's image was shaped and reinterpreted by various generations and political movements. For the French monarchy, she represented the divine union between God and the king, the guarantee of the legitimacy of the throne. For Catholics, she was the pure virgin who heard the voices of God and died for her faith, an example of devotion and sacrifice. Her story was told and retold in plays, poems, songs, and works of art, solidifying her presence in the popular imagination. In the 19th century, with the rise of modern nationalism, Joan of Arc was embraced as the supreme symbol of the French nation. In a period of conflicts and internal divisions, such as the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War, her figure served as a powerful unifying link. She represented rural and authentic France, the strength of the common people against external and, at times, internal enemies. Writers, artists, and historians idealized her, transforming her into an almost mythical figure. The process of her canonization by the Catholic Church was a crucial milestone in her elevation. Formally initiated in the late 19th century, partly as a response by the French Church to the anti-clericalism of the Third Republic, the process culminated in 1909 with her beatification, and finally, in 1920, with her canonization by Pope Benedict XV. Saint Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, officially became the secondary patron saint of France, with her feast day celebrated on May 30th, the date of her execution. Her elevation to sainthood cemented her image as a divine intercessor and an example of Christian virtue. The construction of Joan of Arc as a national heroine and patron saint is a testament to the power of historical narratives and the need for symbols that can unite a people. Her figure transcended her own history to become a timeless icon, adaptable to different contexts and interpretations. From the peasant girl of Domremy to the saint of Rouen, Joan of Arc remains one of the most captivating and inspiring figures in history, a symbol of faith, courage, and resistance that continues to resonate with generations, not only in France but throughout the world. Her legacy is proof that the faith and determination of a single individual can indeed change the course of history and shape the identity of a nation. Joan of Arc's death in 1431 and her subsequent rehabilitation process in 1456 were crucial events that catalyzed France's transformation, but the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453 marked the true birth of a new era for the kingdom. Joan's influence, though no longer physically present, resonated deeply in French morale and in the legitimation of Charles VII's monarchy. Her figure, now a symbol of resistance and faith, propelled the final reconquest. The war did not end immediately after Joan's death, but the momentum she had generated continued. Charles VII, previously hesitant, had been transformed by Joan's experience. He became a more confident and assertive king, surrounded by more competent advisors. The military reforms implemented by the king, including the creation of a professional army and artillery, modernized the French forces, overcoming the English archers' tactics. The Battle of Castillon in 1453, which resulted in a decisive French victory, and the death of John Talbot, the legendary English commander who had captured Joan, is considered the last major confrontation of the 100 Years' War, consolidating the definitive expulsion of the English from almost all French territory, with the exception of Calais. The end of the 100 Years' War brought about a profound political and economic restructuring for France. The monarchy was consolidated, centralizing power and diminishing the influence of the feudal nobility. Charles VII, now the victorious or well-served, governed a more unified and strong kingdom. Lands were recovered, and the reconstruction of war-devastated areas began. The economy, though shaken, started a slow recovery process, driven by stability and peace. The sense of French national identity, previously fragmented by regional and feudal loyalties, emerged stronger than ever, with Joan of Arc as a unifying symbol. The English presence in France, which had lasted for centuries, was drastically reduced, allowing France to focus on its own internal development. The kingdom became one of Europe's major powers, paving the way for the French Renaissance and the rise of figures like Louis XV, who would continue the work of centralizing royal power. Society, though still marked by the scars of war and plague, began to reorganize, with a cultural rebirth and an increase in literacy in some regions. Joan of Arc's legacy transcended her life and death. Her story was a catalyst that, in retrospect, accelerated the end of an era of fragmentation and the birth of a modern, centralized nation. France, which Joan had set out to save, emerged from the conflict stronger and more united, an indirect testament to the enduring impact of her faith, courage, and sacrifice. The post-war political and economic scenario was one of renewal and growth, where the figure of the peasant woman from Domremy remained a beacon of inspiration for future generations.